Good morning. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. If you could all turn your phones to silent or off, that would be great. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if you do hear the fire alarm, please vacate the building via the entrance you came in, and I'll hand you over to your chair. Thanks.
Good afternoon to all of you. Very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Goldin, I'm the director of the school, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting this panel on the future of Africa with three authors who've recently brought out books which pertain to Africa, not necessarily to the future of Africa, but they've thought very deeply about different dimensions of Africa, and so I think are well placed to help us think about the future of the continent. We're addressing three questions on this panel. The first is, how can the continent deal with failing government and corruption? The second is, how far is Africa a victim of the past? And the third, what can the rest of the world do to help Africa grow and prosper? We have on my far left Tom Burgis, who's a journalist for the FT. He's worked in West Africa, in South Africa, and other parts of Africa. He's currently in London working as an investigative journalist for the FT, and his book is The Looting Machine: How the Oil and Mining Business Has Cursed Africa. Martin Meredith, on my immediate left, is a historian and journalist who's written many books on Africa. I first read his book on Nelson Mandela. He's also written The State of Africa, a book on Zimbabwe, and his most recent book is Born in Africa, which he will also talk to. And on my right is Professor Jonny Steinberg, who's at Oxford's African Studies Centre, only for the next month, I regret, and has written many books that have been widely recognized, won the Alan Paton Prize in South Africa twice for his books The Number and Midlands, and his most recent book is The Man of Good Hope. Jonny's also written a blog as to why he's going back to South Africa. For those who are interested in that question, I commend that blog to you. They'll all be signing their books afterwards. What we're going to do is start with the big picture, with Martin talking about the broad themes, followed by Tom on oil, and Jonny, who focuses more on specific individuals and their contributions and how they are shaped by Africa. So Martin, about 5 minutes each, then we'll have a conversation and open it up.
Well, there are very few certainties about the future of Africa, but there are a number of trends which deserve attention. And the first, and I think probably the most important, is the growth of Africa's population. 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, Africa had a population of about an estimated 130 million people. In 2009, it reached the 1 billion mark. The projections are, by the United Nations, that by 2050, the population of Africa will have doubled from what it is now to about 2.3 billion. It's the fastest growing population in the world. And coupled with that is a huge growth in urbanization. Africa, again, is the largest growing population in urban areas in the world at the moment. To give you an idea of how the populations are accelerating, it took 27 years for Africa to add 500 million people to its population. It will take only 17 years for the next 500 million to be added to that total. Now, that places an enormous strain on the resources that Africa has. Africa is potentially one of the richest continents in the world, but it is actually kind of the poorest continent on the world. But the growth of urban population means is that governments basically will not be able to cope in any sufficient way with the growth of population. The strain on government resources will be too great. What will happen in African towns is that they will become huge conglomerations. The picture which is forecast is of a few islands of modern kind of consumer the centres of cities and towns, surrounded by miles and miles and miles of shanty towns, where the basics aren't even available, the basics of sanitation or adequate housing. What this means is that the growth of population also has a huge impact on the extent of unemployment. Only about 30% of Africa's population has some form of wage earning ability, which means is that 70% are basically either subsistence level or just above subsistence level, backyard businesses or whatever. The change that will occur will mean that at the moment Africa's population, about 40% is in towns. By 2050 there will be 60% in towns. This is likely to produce what the United Nations report in 2010 said, a completely kind of dysfunctional system. This is regardless of whether you have good government or bad government. If you have good government, the resources aren't adequate to deal with the problem. The problem is, we'll no doubt come on to this, but an awful lot of Africa already has dysfunctional government, where resources are diverted for usually reasons of personal gain or wasted projects or whatever there is. So just looking at it from the point of view of population growth, there is a huge problem on the horizon. As far as economic prospects go, Africa, indeed for centuries, has been dependent on various commodities in ancient times. It was gold and slaves and ivory. Those were the three main commodities that the rest of the world prized. Africa, even after 50 years of independence, and certainly all the way through the 20th century, was heavily dependent on commodities and therefore commodity prices. For a period of about 40 years after the independence of the 1960s, most governments failed on their economic development programs. For a period of 10 or 12 years in this century, there was a boom in commodity prices from which Africa has benefited quite substantially. There's also been a huge interest by China, and China's interest is really in pursuit of the vast store of minerals that Africa possesses. And this has had a double effect. First of all, China is willing to do all kinds of deals in Africa to obtain those minerals, and therefore it's willing to build railways and roads and football stadiums on a scale which hasn't really happened since independence. And because of China's burgeoning economy and its demand for its own kind of mineral supplies, this has also had an impact on commodity prices. But the commodity prices are variable. They're not fixed. And you can see what's happening to the oil price at the moment, which means is that various African governments which thought they were in a good position, Angola, Nigeria, Libya, but for obvious reasons there are other difficulties there. But the oil producers are now, having had kind of huge development projects, are in considerable trouble. Politically, I've probably gone over 5 minutes already, but politically, Africa is overshadowed by its past. Almost all the countries of Africa are artificial entities. They were created by European powers in the 19th century by politicians and officials, European politicians and officials, who had scant information about what went on the ground. The result is that 10,000 African polities, different kinds, monarchies, chiefdoms, and cephalous societies, were amalgamated into large countries where competing interests continually rise to the surface, which means that African politics tend to be unstable. And I think I've probably had my 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Martin. So I'm just going to move this back so that people...
Oh, I can move myself forward.
Yeah.
So let's crack on.
Yeah, please.
I put this question of the future of Africa a few years ago to a friend in Lagos, where I was living when I was the correspondent for the FT there. And he's a guy called Richard Accarelli, who is a sort of well-to-do businessman, educated in Britain, but still very much a Lagos man. You know, the chat round his dinner table is in Pidgin mostly. And he's one of the people in Nigeria who for a long time has tried to make an honest buck, trying to retain his integrity. These days he runs airport lounges, he advises presidents, and he's a sort of overwhelmingly and infectiously optimistic man. He has this sort of twinkle and this mischievous sense of humour, and even in Nigeria with its sort of endless troubles, he's always grinning. And we were sitting and chatting about Nigerian politics. I think it was about 2010, difficult year for Nigeria, but still Richard looked as though he thought everyone would muddle through. And I said to him, it got later and later, and I eventually said to him, "So Richard, what is the future? What is Africa's future?" And this twinkle vanished, and his face fell, and he just said, "Africa will be a mine, and Africans will be the drones of the world." Which is a terrifying idea, especially from a very optimistic man. But I have a nasty feeling that to some extent, at least, he's onto something. And I think what he's onto is, and Martin was talking about this a bit as well, is this overwhelming dominance in African economies and political economies of natural resources, of oil and minerals. And the structure that comes from that is a pretty poisonous one. And Nigeria is one of the best examples. If you have a government like Nigeria's that's funded 70% of the Nigerian government's income comes from renting out oil and gas to be shipped off by foreign companies. And about 4% of the government's income comes from directly taxing the people of Nigeria. And it just seems blindingly obvious from that kind of distortion that the government doesn't, in the simplest term, need the consent of the people to rule. And so you have something like that Nigerian election that's going on now, very close, very tense, but that'll probably, in all likelihood, do very little to change that underlying structure. And it's the same structure in Angola. It's even worse in South Sudan. I think about 98% of the South Sudanese government's income is from oil. And as I worked on this book and did these postings in Africa again and again, I saw this model, and others might disagree, but it just seemed to me as though that basic social contract between rulers and ruled is broken by this dependency on oil and minerals. And it also has a broader economic effect that sits with what Martin was saying about the lack of a big formal economy, a big formal group of people in decent jobs paying taxes and calling the government to account for how they spend those taxes. There are these insidious effects of economic dependency on oil and minerals, Dutch disease as it's called, and other distortions that throttle off the prospects for the kind of economic development that's lifted huge amounts of people out of poverty elsewhere. Manufacturing, basically. Africa's share of global manufacturing was about 1% in the late 90s, and now Africa's share in global manufacturing is about 1%. Despite all this talk of Africa rising in a boom, it's been largely a commodities boom, which in many ways has just pushed more kind of poisonous rent money through the system. And my second point, and then I'll stop, is this idea of a new kind of financial colonialism. And I very much think that's the case. What was colonialism? I hesitate to try to find this next to Martin, who's written so much about it, but in essence, for me, it's the interests of a state, of a territorial area being suborned to the interests of a foreign power operating through a client elite. And as is the fashion, that's been replicated in a privatized way. And just to give you one example, Martin mentioned Angola. I mean, Angola's had these spectacular economic growth numbers, but it's also had one of the worst performances in the world of turning economic growth into improved living standards. And why is that? It's because you have a small presidential coterie, as you do in many, especially resource-rich African nations, that has fused the interest of the state, that has fused the Commonwealth, if you like, with its private interests. It's called the Futungu in Angola, this group around President Dos Santos, who's been there for 35 years, I think now. And one of the cases I tried to look at in the book is that the state awarded the right to an enormous oil prospect under the sea off Angola's coast to a company from Houston, backed by Goldman Sachs and other huge names from Wall Street. And the state oil company insisted that there be a local partner for this oil venture. And the local partner is secretly owned by the head of the state oil company, the head of presidential security, and a former head of communications in the government. And it's this fusing of elites into the kind of Davos man, globalized economy that detaches them from the states they're supposed to rule, I think. There's similar patterns in Congo. There was the Dadaist junta in Guinea that was bailed out by a group of Hong Kong investors. Again and again, this pattern's happening. And so my final point is that I don't think necessarily the future of Africa is detached from the future of the world. I think Africa is very much plugged into the global economy as the kind of the lowest layer on the supply chain, exporting raw materials. And it's a lot of its ruling classes are kind of floating away from the countries they rule. Their children are educated abroad, they get medical attention abroad, a lot of their money sits in tax havens abroad. And as to what the outside world can do, I think it could stop facilitating those illicit flows of money and those dodgy deals that detach these ruling classes from the countries they rule.
Great. Jonny.
Thanks, Ian. Africa is a big and very diverse place, and I think that when one speaks of it in the singular, one inevitably is a level of abstraction that misses something important. So I don't want to speak of Africa as a whole. I want to concentrate on what I think is new in Africa in the last generation. And one thing is new is a coupling of very strong governance, authoritarian governance, with illiberal state projects, which is entirely new in Africa. And let's go back in the 1970s and 1980s, there were two political scientists by the name of Jackson and Rosberg who pretty much shaped our understanding of African politics. And what they said is that Africa's problem is that its states were juridical rather than sociological. And what they meant is that these states had been formed by international agreement rather than by any internal capacity, rather than a relation of taxation and representation, monopolization of violence. They were really paper states because they were simply states by virtue of external recognition. And the result is that all they were really good for was gatekeeping and corruption. They had very little internal control over their societies. And implicit in this argument was a comparison with the formation of European states much earlier through warfare. States formed through warfare are stronger. They organize their societies. They enter into contracts with their societies to raise money for warfare. That has changed in many African countries. Africa has been through wars in the late colonial and the late Cold War and early post-Cold War area, which have had African states now emerge through warfare. And there are very, very different sorts of states. There haven't been any like them on the African continent before. I'm thinking of Rwanda, Angola, Ethiopia, Sudan. They're characterized first and foremost by a reach into their own societies, which is unprecedented in Africa. Not just militarily, but also through a civilian bureaucracy. I'm lumping these countries together, and they're very different. Ethiopia has a ruling party now, has about 3 or 4 million members. Its intelligence services are throughout the society. It has a reach and a sophistication which is new and unusual and should be noted. This increasing sophistication is absolutely not coupled with civil liberties or democracy. Most of these societies jump through hoops of having elections every 5 years. Ironically, in some cases, it makes their hold over the society stronger. Ethiopian ruling party nearly lost its election in 2005 and increased its grip, particularly over the margins of its big cities and over youth populations to an extraordinary degree. I think that this newness sometimes gets lost. We talk about continuing reliance on commodities, which is true. We talk about continuing corruption, which is true. But I think we have very different states here. They're also very sophisticated diplomatic players, much more so than previous African states. And it isn't a simple old colonial relationship. It's something new and I think needs to be registered and understood. And if these societies are going to change, I'd suspect that the changes are going to come from the inside more than from the outside. there are all of these countries I'm talking about growing very rapidly. And sometimes, ironically, rapid growth can create a great deal of instability. Whether they can hold on to the grip of their societies in the next 10 years or so is going to be interesting. So that's something that's new that I think is often missed and should be remembered. Something else that's new, which also comes from warfare in the late Cold War and early post-Cold War period, is the nature and the size of the African diaspora has changed enormously, and this matters a great, great deal. I mean, firstly, it's increased enormously in absolute numbers, but perhaps even more importantly, the sorts of people who have left the African continents, the demographic of those who've left the African continents has changed as a result of these wars. And the impact on African economy is hard to tell, but you can see some signs, and they're very, very interesting. Standard foreign direct investment usually requires that those investing in a continent can see it, can find it legible. Forms of the rule of law they can understand. Legal, rational, bureaucratic institutions that they can understand. If they don't have those, the sorts of investments you can make are very limited, very short term. There's African diaspora capital going into parts of African economies that other forms of FDI can't get anywhere near because they don't understand. These are parts of the economy governed by informal institutions, by common law, by customary law. So for instance, if one looks at the urban economy of Nairobi, the center of gravity of white goods, of many services, of apparel, of clothes, has shifted to Eastleigh, which is the center of Somali migration into Nairobi. It's had a major, major impact on the urban economy, and that's directly as the result of refugees who have fled the Horn of Africa to other parts of the world and set up trading links. They behave in ways that other economic actors in African history haven't before. This is really interesting stuff. And a quick final example, again from the Horn of Africa. Somaliland is a territory without sovereignty, which means it cannot raise donor funds, it cannot raise loan capital. Therefore, it didn't have the means that any other state does to build a destroyed infrastructure when it came to power. And that infrastructure is now coming together, and it's funded by diaspora capital in utilities such as electricity and water, in a burgeoning business sector. So there's something under the surface going on that's very, very interesting. And given the size of the diaspora and given the size of new flows, these new things could be shaping. So my appeal is yes, that it's a difficult continent. What I'm saying isn't necessarily optimistic. I'm just saying that it can be possible for observers simply to get stuck in a sense of Africa which is old. It's very, very difficult to see the new amidst all the old. But the new is certainly there, whether for good or bad, things are happening on the continent.
Thanks, Jonny. I think that raises two questions which I wanted us to briefly address before we open up. The first is it really, does it make sense to talk about Africa as one unit? We wouldn't talk about everything from the Shetlands to Vladivostok in this way, or from Alaska to the point of South America in this way. And if there were Kosovos and Russias and other disasters happening, we wouldn't say Europe is in crisis. But we do it with Africa all the time. Does this make sense? And the second is the sort of strong pessimism I'm hearing from Tom and Martin in face of the numbers. Africa is certainly growing at a faster rate on average than it's ever grown historically over a sustained period of time, over 5%. In the UK, we'll be lucky to grow at 1%, so this is a big number. Per capita growth is high. It has some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it's competing with Asia. And also, if one looks forward, what can be the demographic curse, which you've talked about, Martin, many would interpret as a demographic blessing. It has a demographic window opening where it's slamming close the rest of the world. So it has a younger population, which means it has many advantages going forward, obviously, if they can be educated and engaged economically and otherwise, than any other region in the world. So many see what you would regard as a curse as a blessing. And I'd just like to tease that out a bit before we open it up. Would you like to start, Mark?
Well, I don't see it as a curse. I see it as an issue which needs to be tackled head on. If you read the United Nations 2010 report, Habitat report, it actually says that not only do this is just dealing with the population growth, not only do African governments lack the means to deal with population growth, they lack the will. Now, I don't look on Africa as a pessimist in the least. I look on it as a realist. There are scales of problems which Africa faces, and I entirely agree it is absurd to look at the entire continent of 54 countries as a kind of single unit. But nevertheless, there are patterns which you can discern there. Pretty well all African countries, as I was saying before, are the product of European colonialism. Europe ruled Africa for a period of 70 years, and there are very similar features that many African countries have as a result of European colonialism. One of which is the lack of preparedness that there was for independence, and an awful lot of problems actually kind of flow from that. But so I'm, if you like, a realist and always have been about Africa's kind of prospects. The point that you mentioned about growth figures, well, you can juggle with statistics as long as you want, but 5% of a very, very low base, coming off a very low base, is nothing really that counts. You can't compare the growth of let's say, the British economy at 2%. It translates into billions and billions of pounds. In Africa, that isn't the case. But it is actually kind of the point that Tom is making is a kind of, it's not a feature that is going to kind of change. There are basically systems of corruption and systems of patronage, which is even more important, which have now become deeply embedded in Africa, which allows ruling elites to cream off vast personal fortunes, to stash the money in foreign bank accounts, to buy foreign properties abroad. I mean, the World Bank figure for the amount of money, that private wealth, that is held by Africans outside Africa, it's 40% of Africa's private wealth is held outside Africa. And if you look at those sort of statistics, that's far more dramatic than a notional 5% increase, if you like, as a result of commodity price. Nigeria last year, was now boasting to be the largest economy in Africa. But with the collapse of the oil price, that it will possibly kind of fall from that pedestal, such as it is. This year, it comes again into the sort of notion that is very often spoken of about Africa rising. And Africa rising comes directly from this increase in commodity prices in the 21st century. The commodity price rises have stopped, they're on the decline. Therefore, do the people who advocate that Africa is rising now go along with the notion that Africa is falling? It's nonsense.
Great. Tom, let's be very brief, otherwise we won't have enough time.
Yeah, quickly, I think Martin's covered a lot of the points, and I would agree with a lot of them. Just on the idea of, yes, of course it's absurd to look at Africa as one big blob, but I think what we're looking at really is global trends. I mean, these ideas of massive amounts of wealth being held outside the countries in which they're made and on which tax should be paid on them.
Just on that question, I've seen the data for Latin America, for example, which looks very comparable, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is, yeah. And the Thabo Mbeki report recently on $60 billion pouring out of Africa a year in sort of accounting fiddles within multinationals largely. It's the trends are the same everywhere. I think it's part of the same trend that gets people outraged when that Jimmy Carr, was it, the comedian, was found to have stashed a load of his tax money abroad. People are outraged by the idea of people not contributing to the Commonwealth from which they benefit in all sorts of ways. It's just that it's most acute in lots of African countries because the states are very young and very fragile. and there are far more poor people, therefore the problems are far more acute, and the impact of that hemorrhaging of wealth out is far more acute.
Yeah. Martin, I think Africa has already experienced its demographic crisis. You know, we call it the debt crisis and structural adjustments of the 70s and 80s. But that was inextricably bound up with the fact that from the 1940s and 50s, Africa's population began growing at extraordinary rates. It trebled its size between 1940 and 1990, and fertility rates are now no longer what they were 25, 30 years ago. One could argue that a combination of very bad economic and political management and an enormous surge in population is what destroyed African institutions in the 70s and 80s. We're looking at a different picture now. I mean, the sorts of basic institutions that service the population, particularly education, healthcare, they're terrible in parts of the African continent. But if one looks at the social statistics as a whole, the continent's in much, much better shape than it was in the 1970s and 80s. And it's not growing nearly as fast. Institutions can probably contain and absorb growth more than they could. So I think the coming crisis you're talking about is a crisis that's come and gone.
Okay, that's a good basis for discussion. The gentleman on the far left, there's a mic, yeah, and we'll sort of gradually move across. Keep your questions pointed and short, so we have time for plenty. And your responses too, please.
Can I just ask where you put Botswana in this context? My eldest daughter and family live there. We've been going there for the last 20 years, and we have noticed very much in the last 4 or 5 years the increasing financial input and influence of China.
Okay, we're going to collect a few questions, so we'll start in that corner there.
I just when Martin spoke about the kleptocratic leader profiteering from office, I felt for a moment he was talking about Tony Blair and that we were on the wrong continent. I think that the reference to the Thabo Mbeki report is slightly corrective, and we need to move away from the idea that there are emanations of place that link up to corruption. So I think that's one of the more gross generalizations. The other question I have, which this being an FT conference, it may not be out of place to ask, I just want to understand whether Tracy Rose, who's quoted in the Africa supplement of the FT today, is crazy or not. So that's the question, and I'll read the quote. She said, relating to her work with cave drawings and cave paintings when she embarked upon the study of these, that she was, quote, incredibly frustrated by the fact that they had been wrongly interpreted by white scholars. I had to have a white man tell me about myself, and I reacted to that fact perhaps more than the content. So is she irrational, angry, and to be set aside before we continue the conversation, or is that in some sense a legitimate thing about dialogue about Africa at a conference like this and more generally?
Thanks, Ron. The person next to you, and then behind.
Related to the question before this last one here, I wonder what the panel thinks about the impact of China upon sub-Saharan Africa.
I'm just wondering whether we're moving from one extreme to the other, from extreme pessimism to extreme optimism, from Africa is hopeless basket case to Africa rising, Africa is the new frontier of whatever. And I'm just wondering whether it would be more useful to really look at this as a sort of, like a spectrum, from that one extreme to the other, and place several African countries along that spectrum. Or maybe a more useful research agenda would be to sort of group different countries in different categories. So for instance, countries that have had the experience of of colonialism from Anglophone countries, you would find that their state capacities are quite different from those that have experienced colonialism from France, for instance, or coastal countries vis-a-vis landlocked countries, or southern African countries vis-a-vis West African countries. You would find that, for instance, even the participation of women in these countries are actually very different. That is participation of women in politics, for instance. Anyways, the point I'm making is really we have to find a way of bringing more nuance to research, whether it's research or whether it's books or whether it's conferences like these. Because just looking at African countries as these hotbeds of corruption or as these new centers for growth and economic management and international finance, I think it's a bit unhelpful. Thank you.
Thank you. We have lots of hands up and we only have 20 minutes, so do keep your points short if possible. Let's come back to the panel. Who'd like to start? Tom, do you want to respond on behalf of the FT? You can say
on behalf of the FT. No, on behalf of the FT, I should say categorically that I really must start reading my own paper. I think that the point is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the extent to which it's valid for white people to talk about Africa broadly, or for white people to tell Africans what Africa's like.
Well, I think that the question that I was looking for is not, I mean, Ian Goldin certainly ought to be here on Africa and happens to be African.
Yeah.
Jonny Steinberg is African. So that's not the issue. I wouldn't say it was only an issue of race, but about dialogue and the diversity of views on the continent.
Yeah. I think I broadly agree with that. And I think I would agree that African voices are obviously those that should be heard above all others about Africa. I think that's just a given. But I do think there's something to be said in Africa or anywhere else for, partly this because for years I was a foreign correspondent, there's something to be said for the outsider's eye, I think, and there's something to be said for the ability of outsiders to critique the outside part of this relationship that we're talking about. We're talking in part about a new kind of financial colonialism, and a lot of that, I think we are, and a lot of that is run from London and New York and the Caribbean and Switzerland and Hong Kong. And I think outsiders from those places can have a valid perspective from there and make a valid critique. But I take your point that there's been a lot of nonsense chatted by white people about Africa for a very long time. The other point I was just going to quickly respond to was from the lady behind you. I can't quite see now. That I'd strongly agree with that. The idea of the nuances being very important, and also this idea of coastal Africa. I mean, again, obviously that in itself is a generalisation, but especially in West Africa, I think a lot of this whole idea of Africa rising, another generalisation, was based on Lagos, but before Ebola it was based, I think, on the recovery of Sierra Leone and Liberia, changes happening in Guinea. And even within those countries, but also within the region, I think there's a concentration of opportunity on the coast, yeah, and especially like Lagos, it's obviously been booming, but northern Nigeria clearly isn't, and that I think there's really important distinctions to draw.
So I'm just aware that lots of other people want to still ask questions.
There are a couple of questions about China, and it is kind of hugely important. China's interest really is a 21st century phenomenon as far as Africa is concerned. China's ambition is to become, and this is stated quite openly, is to become the most important foreign player in Africa, and it's well on its way to doing that. There are advantages and disadvantages in China's approach. Western business used to operate in Africa on the basis of bribes and 10% and various things like that. It's now impossible for Western business to operate on that basis. But the Chinese have no such kind of hesitation. Their aim is to acquire contracts for minerals and oil, and they are prepared to go to great lengths to do that. There are huge benefits in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of railways, ports, roads, football stadiums, hotels. There are now about 1 million Chinese residents in Africa. They're involved in everything from farming to retail, trade to restaurants. They are a formidable force. You can go to the kind of backwaters of South Africa, a place like Zeerust, which used to be in kind of the Western Transvaal, and you will find Chinese there operating stores 14 hours a day, outclassing just about everybody else in local kind of business. The drawbacks about China is that, first of all, the critics claim, and I think there's a great deal to be said for this, is that just as the West is trying to impose conditions about corruption on African states and the way contracts are run, the Chinese have no inhibitions, and therefore the critics claim that China actually encourages corruption, and I think there's a great deal to be said about that. There are also kind of claims about malpractices in terms of working conditions, poor wages, and other forms of kind of working conditions. Another factor is, and there is a much kind of wider point to be made here, is that the Chinese are heavily involved in the ivory trade, which is leading to the decimation of the African elephant herds, and there's no sign of that actually stopping. That doesn't only affect the elephants or indeed rhinoceros.
Okay, Jonny, I'm going to make you respond in your next round.
Fair enough.
Okay, the people over here and the woman over there.
Thanks. A question to Mark, International Day of the Landless. Are any of you worried about the future, for the future of Africa, the impact of the global land grab?
Yesterday, Nigerians voted using fingerprint technology. I just wondered about comments of the impact of technology over the next 20 years or so, not just sort of economically, but politically as well.
Woman over there.
The strikingly high ethno-linguistic fractionalization in sub-Saharan Africa seems to be one common element of the area. I was wondering about suggestions you have for tackling the political instability and potential hindrance of policy making that it causes in the region.
The man right in the corner there.
What I want to know is that, can Africa rise with all this cliche going on, Africa rising and it's the time of Africa? If you look at Africa, I think it's going backwards instead of forward. Ghana celebrated their 58th anniversary on the 6th of March. Singapore did it on their 50th anniversary. Singapore has managed to move from swamp to skyscrapers, and it seems we are going backwards. In Ghana at the moment, they cannot even have power after 58 years of independence. So are we rising, or we are rather retrogressing?
Okay, the woman over here. You're going to need to exercise your retentive capabilities.
Could the panel say something about what they would ideally recommend as policy for, leaving aside China, developing countries active in Africa with aid programs? Thank you.
And the woman behind you, then we'll bring it back to the panel. She asked you a question. Very good. Jonny, we're going to start with you.
Okay, well, I can't deal with it all, but let me deal with a couple. Land grabs, it's a very difficult and complex one. I mean, on the one hand, the sort of concessions and agreements signed now look nothing like the concessions agreements African states signed 30, 40 years ago. They are much more sophisticated. They come with much more investment in people around the investment. They're different, and those differences matter. I mean, there is a big question about whether land grabs, certainly in some parts of Liberia, are are destroying rural economies, are putting smallholders out of business, which is a serious problem. Even then, it's quite complicated. I mean, generally, the closer you get to the ground, the more you find that young people in agricultural communities are very, very in favor of investments in palm oil. It's older people holding on to older forms of production. I think that these investments are exacerbating very old strains in many West African and other societies. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, on technology, I mean, one thing that digital technology is doing very, very fast is allowing financial flows that were absolutely inconceivable just 10 years ago, both between Africa and other parts of the world, and between African states and citizens. I think that very, very cumbersome old institutions are no longer necessary. There's a great deal of fluidity, and certainly in the examples I was giving, like the regeneration of retail economy in Nairobi, digital financial instruments have been crucially important. Whether Africa's rising or not, I think that it just ruins the clear thinking about Africa to even ask the question. I mean, the diversity in Africa is immense. Some parts are rising, some are going back. I think that to try and conceptualize the continent as one is enormously damaging, especially when the outside world does so. It means that very, very important dynamics get completely drowned, completely invisible. And the more we can get into the mental attitude of not thinking of Africa as a country, whether rising or falling, the better.
Martin.
Well, just on the land grab issue, I think it's hugely important. And it really dates from 2008, which is quite recent, because of the food security scare that there was. Africa has the largest uncultivable land in the world. The food scare of 2008 set off a sort of avalanche of interest. What this has led to, I mean, I would point out that this isn't a new phenomenon. And the book I recently wrote, called The Fortunes of Africa, looks at 5,000 years of African history. And you can see the way in which the Romans relied on their African colonies to produce food for Rome, and very much the same thing is happening kind of 2,000 years later. But what is happening, and I think probably the reference that you're making to land grabs, is what's going on in places like Ethiopia and Mozambique and Congo-Kinshasa and so on, where old communities, resident communities, are being moved off their land in vast numbers, so that multinational, invariably foreign multinational corporations can set up huge land projects, agricultural projects. And the food that they're actually kind of attempting to grow is not for Africa, it's actually for the rest of the world. This is setting up a whole series of difficulties which I think will come to the fore in the most extreme extent by rural insurrection against, if you like, foreign multinationals taking land kind of from locals. So it is a major issue. On the whole question of whether you look at Africa as a whole or not, obviously that you don't. And indeed, there are the books that all of us have written, and many others, actually kind of don't look at Africa as a whole, and in fact make the point that it's not worthwhile looking at Africa as a whole. On the question about Botswana and so on, Botswana is a very good example of a successful, mineral-rich country which has harnessed its wealth extremely well and has developed from being a poor country into a relatively well-managed and well-structured country. So there are examples that you can look. Unfortunately, the number of countries which are run by kleptocrats, and you can't ignore the extent, the damage that does. The official Nigerian figure for the amount of money looted by Nigeria's rulers over a 40-year period from 1960 is $220 billion US. You can't ignore those sort of, the scale of the damage that is caused by African rulers and politicians who basically get to office with the aim of making personal profits and fortunes for themselves. It's one of the main problems that there are.
Very quick point. Are you, to our friend who asked the question about Africa Rising, are you from Ghana? Yes. Yeah, so very briefly, I mean, I agree with all of this about Africa Rising being so abstract as to be almost meaningless and unhelpful. But to take the example of Ghana, I mean, Ghana was regarded, certainly by Ghanaians, I would say, as one of the best managed countries certainly in West Africa. Not at the moment. But not at the moment, exactly. But for a long time it wasn't. Not at the moment. And what's changed? Oil. Ghana was on the up. I think we could agree. Close elections, the loser would accept the results. Problems, yes, but generally peace. It struck oil and it's gone bust. I just think there's a terribly corrosive influence of oil on African countries, and there's a terrifying prospect of all this East African oil that's been found having a similar effect.
Okay, we have time just for some very... Okay, I'm going to respond to your question. It's been very difficult for me because I've written a lot on Africa and I've worked particularly on aid, so I'll come back to that. Let's quickly take one or two more questions. I think we've just got time for that.
I mean, the other thing you said, is the West doing enough, or what could it do to improve economic good governance within Africa? Because it seems to be a common thread in terms of problems and issues that the continent's facing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone wants that? The woman over there? You have the last question.
Hello, and just thought about your role of like donor organisations and in terms of national budgets. So historically, particularly like post-independence for a lot of African states, they've accounted for a significant percentage of their national budget. So I was in Malawi and I think it accounted for something like 40% of the national budget. But in terms of like fostering dependency, I mean, what do you see the role of kind of donor organisations in the future? So, you know, expanding on the aid question.
Okay, give the last.
My question is there an entrepreneurial deficit in Africa? I mean, aside from Aliko Dangote, long before the Chinese came there with the brute force of wealth, Indians did really well through centuries. But why haven't Africans stepped into that, what I see as a deficit?
Okay, I'm going to give each of the panelists 1 minute. Is that something we have time for? I'll take 1 minute, and then you'll have plenty of opportunity to engage with them personally, because we're going to do a book signing afterwards, so you can go up to them and chat if we haven't had time to respond to your questions. And I will also be doing, I think, a book signing on my books there, so you can chat to all of us about our work on this and other topics. Jonny.
I'm not going to take a minute. I mean, there are very old traditions of African entrepreneurship. I mean, stereotypically Igbo and Kikuyu, which are changing very fast as a result of human movements and which are producing a great deal of wealth. There's also a new form of African entrepreneurship, again created by movement, which is Somali. Somali migration patterns have been stuck in the same pattern for generations, and ironically, warfare have put Somalis and Somali mentalities into different economies. So I think that African entrepreneurship is changing in quite interesting and often unrecorded ways.
If you want to really see a story about African entrepreneurs, that would be Somali, read Jonny's book. This is an entrepreneur like I've never read about before. Tom.
Yeah, just quickly, a lot of questions about aid and donor organisations and what have you. For me, a lot of that is very problematic and fits into a sort of paternalistic narrative about Africa, and I just think on the numbers as well, there's enormous parts of the Daily Express and the Daily Mail are regularly devoted to an amount of money which is a pittance by the standards of a Western economy, but is also minute compared to the amount of money that is looted from Africa by Western and increasingly Chinese corporations and by and through this kind of the hidden parts of the financial system that's largely based outside Africa. So I think I think it'd be quite important for the debate to move away from aid and towards the idea of stopping these mechanisms of plunder, basically, from the outside.
Just very briefly, I think the central problem that Africa faces is a problem of leadership rather than anything else. It's certainly not a lack of entrepreneurial skill. Go to any African market and it's kind of full of amazing entrepreneurs. And it has been a failure of leadership really ever kind of since independence from Europe's colonial powers. And that is you can look at the degrees of effectiveness of various leaders. And the way in which there was an opportunity by various leaders to establish stable and beneficial states. Léopold Senghor in Senegal is a classic example of how that worked and how it established a tradition in Senegal. And indeed, Seretse Khama in Botswana is another example. But the list of African leaders who failed is enormous. It's very, very long, and it doesn't actually go on improving. So that the central point really about Africa's future is the problem that Africa's leadership, the failure, if you like, of Africa's leaders to deal with the problems.
Let me briefly address the question of aid. I think there are a number of points that can be made. One is that aid remains a very small part of any development story. On average, it's about 4% of African budget income comes from aid. Sometimes at some places like Malawi, it might go up to 40%. That's very unusual in time. The second is that the real question is to what extent does it do the things that others can't do? And as much as people talk about the role of the private sector and others paying for rural roads or rural water supplies or nurses, private sector basically doesn't do. And that depends on local governments. So it depends on how effective the local governments are at prioritizing expenditures. It also depends on the predictability of the aid, because a lot of these things require multi-year budgets, and it depends on the donors not telling the countries what to do according to their own pet projects and wanting to raise flags when their ministers visit. So harmonization, alignment are absolutely crucial. Tanzanian finance minister on average will entertain 20,000 foreign delegations a year who want to meet him. All who have their own accounting and other standards. So this is the sort of problem of proliferation. There's huge progress. I was at the Millennium Summit in 2000, the MDGs, all of that has made enormous progress in the new aid. So we are playing the same game now. There's alignment, and I think there's been a vast improvement. So aid is probably 5 times more effective than it was in the 1990s, when 10 billion went to dictator Mobutu in Democratic Republic of what's now Democratic Republic of Congo. But there's still progress to be made. There's of course new donors as well, the Gateses, the many others. I'm on the board of CDC, which is the UK government's aid agency, which is doing private financing. And there's China and new players. I would disagree with the view that China's bad news. I think if you speak to any African I've ever spoken to, whatever level they are, from prime minister to entrepreneur, they love the choice that they now have. Greater choice, greater competition for resources, and greater markets. Some of the most interesting Africans are doing business in China. Entrepreneurs, including a lot of people that I know who are making very interesting new contacts. Of course, there's a bad side, like there is with rhino poaching and everything, that has to be stopped. But I think on the whole, Africa and diversification of aid sources, as long as it's aligned to national interests, is a good thing. And there's plenty more on that and its relationship to trade, other things, in my book, Globalization for Development. So we all have books, and we hope that you found this stimulating, that you'll continue to engage with Africa, that it's helped you expand your own frontiers of knowledge. And thank you for coming out on such a blustery day.